North Otsira, South Otsira, southeasterly 3, increasing 4 or 5,
Fisher,
occasionally
German
6
bite.
later,
West or northwest 3 or 4, increasing 5 or 6.
Fastnet, Irish Sea,
Showers.
west backing
Good.
southwest 4 or 5, occasionally 6 later in North Irish Sea. Mainly
A curved chain of islands facing into the Atlantic, the Outer Hebrides represents Scotland's last frontier. From Lewis, whose northern tip lies on the same latitude as John O'Groats, to the southernmost isle of Mingulay, roughly level with Aberdeen, the Western Isles have provided a constant barrier against the weather and waves of the Atlantic for the west coast of Scotland. The Isle of Barra is the southernmost inhabited island of the chain, and was the filming location of the classic 1949 Ealing comedy Whiskey Galore. It's typical Ealing, gentle, on the side of the little guy, and very funny. Behind the film, however, based on then Barra resident Compton Mackenzie's novel of the same name, is a true story. For Great Todday, read Barra's closest neighbouring island, Eriskay, and for the SS Cabinet Minister, read SS Politician. I was booked into the imposing Castle Bay Hotel, overlooking the harbour. Being a lone traveller, of course, instead of having a room with a sweeping maritime vista dominated by an ancient castle, I was at the back of the building with a sweeping refuse vista dominated by wheelie bins. Eriskay, the location of the real Whiskey Galore story, is a short ferry trip across the Sound from Barra. Despite its boozy heritage, the island's pub opened as recently as 1988. If there was nothing to see of the original incident, I would at least have a whiskey on the island of Whiskey Galore. It was mid-afternoon when I presented myself at the bar. A young girl appeared and gave me a smile so lovely I might never have left the island. "What can I get you?" she asked. My eye was suddenly caught by a square-shaped bottle on the shelf below the optics. It had no label, and its contents looked cloudier than one of Diego Maradona's urine samples. It couldn't be, could it? "That bottle there," I said, pointing. "It wouldn't be." "This one?" said the girl, laying a hand on it. "Oh, aye, this one came off the Polly." My jaw travelled downwards at precisely the same velocity as my eyebrows went in the other direction. She took it from the shelf and placed it on the counter in front of me. "It's the only one still on the island, apparently," she said. "At least the only one we know about." "Can I?" I asked, wondering if I could pick the bottle up. "Sure." I lifted it off the counter. The contents were opaque, the glass itself tarnished. In the neck of the bottle was a cork, cracked, broken and black. "Have a sniff of the cork," said the girl. I lifted the bottle to beneath my nose and breathed in gently. There was a general musk of old age, but in there somewhere was the definite tang of the water of life. A liquid over half a century old that had survived the bombings of warehouses in Glasgow and Leith, been hoisted aboard the Politician, had slopped around inside this very bottle when the ship ran aground, and then been surreptitiously removed by oil-smeared men at the dead of night. "I think that one was found under the floorboards when an old house was being renovated about 10 years ago," she said. "The whiskey itself is ruined now. A lot of it was contaminated by seawater, and the cork went bad too. But it is an original, from hold number 5 of the Polly." Back in Castle Bay, I popped into the bar next to the hotel, where a big screen was showing Glasgow Celtic playing a Lithuanian team in a Champions League qualifying game. There were around 30 people in the room, most of them wearing Celtic's green and white hooped shirts. Barra, like most of the southern Western Isles, is staunchly Catholic. Had I been in the northern part of the Isles, where Protestantism dominates, everyone would have been wearing the blue shirts of Rangers and becoming honorary Lithuanians for the evening. The reason for the sharp religious divide between North and South dates back to the 17th century, when Father Dermot Duggan set out from the southern tip of the Isles on a mission to convert the locals to Catholicism. From Mingulay he travelled up. He'd got as far as Benbecula by 1657 when he died suddenly, and the divide has been there ever since. The airport that serves the 18 Faroe Islands is located on the remote western island of Vaugar, a considerable distance from the capital, Tórshavn. This is because it's the only island with a piece of flat ground long enough to accommodate a runway, and even then it's one of the shortest in Europe. When flying there for the first time, you may be struck by the frequency and enthusiasm with which the cabin staff ply you with free booze. Once you catch a glimpse of the tiny stretch of tarmac towards which you're barrelling out of the heavens, you soon realise why. The Faroes are roughly halfway between the Shetlands and Iceland, and legend has it that they were created when God cleaned out his fingernails after creating the earth. It's a tough place to live. The terrain is so rocky that it's almost impossible to grow any vegetables other than a few potatoes. But the Faroese are a hardy bunch, and the population of a little under 48,000 has created a thriving, vibrant nation, albeit one under Danish protection. As I sat and watched darkness fall over the Toshaun, the colourful fishing boats turning monochrome and then disappearing into the darkness, I ruminated to myself that the Faroes are like the shipping forecast in miniature. They certainly have the weather. On average, there is rainfall, or at least some kind of precipitation, on 280 days every year in the islands. Effectively, that means it's raining for 9 months of every year. It's permanently windy, too, as the local phrase, "he who waits will get wind," illustrates. The clash of cyclones means that the wind rarely comes from the same direction for long, which is how the islands earned their self-devised nickname of the Land of Maybe. It was almost impossible to make firm arrangements with people on other islands, as the wind could tie you down for weeks at a time. The Vikings had a strong influence on Faroese history and culture, and the island's remoteness has led linguists to believe that modern Faroese is about as close as you get to the language spoken by the ancient Norse hordes. It's a curious, strangely poetic language, which, according to the glossary in the back of a 1948 book I found about the islands, contains a number of useful words and phrases. Brenna crack, for example, means burning the three-legged stool after turning down a suitor, whilst Vevlingur is a cord worn around the sleeve when digging for puffins. And there's also my favourite, the skenkjari, that popular chap, the man who goes among wedding guests offering them drink. Surprisingly, for one of the longest coastlines of any shipping forecast area, southeast Iceland didn't present me with a great number of options. A cursory glance at the map before I'd left revealed that the town of Herfen was my only choice, but guidebook research suggested Herfen might not be the most fascinating place to end my journey around the shipping forecast. Herfen is a fairly modern fishing and fish processing town, was the most exciting description I could find. In order to keep my options open, I decided not to book internal flights in advance. This meant that, having battled my way through the sleet and strong winds of a murky Reykjavik morning, I presented myself at the ticket desk and asked the price of a return flight to Herfen. "There are no scheduled flights to Herfen tomorrow, sir. There may be a bus you could take." 15 minutes later, I was for the second time that day presenting myself, windswept, bedraggled, and not a little squelchy about the feet, at a ticket office inquiring about going to Herfen. "I'm afraid you missed the bus to Herfen today." I squelched down onto a plastic seat in Reykjavik bus station. Despite numerous public transport links, I couldn't even get to bloody Herfen. For the first time on the entire shipping forecast journey, I felt completely dejected. I was sitting facing a rack of timetables and brochures. Along one shelf was a row of blue and yellow leaflets bearing the instruction, "Take the Herjulfur ferry to Vestmannaeyjar," in big letters on the front. I stood up, picked up one of the leaflets and opened it. The bus ride to Thorláksherfen was treacherous. The bus was a full-sized coach that the driver struggled manfully to control in the face of giant gusts of rain-spattered wind, which swept ferociously over the bleak volcanic plains. We finally arrived at Thorláksherfen harbour, where the Herjulfur was moored. I bought my ticket, boarded the ship and took a seat in the cafeteria. Beyond the harbour wall, through the spray, I could see massive waves smashing against the rocks in giant fantails of spume. Torrents of rain spattered the windows, the wind screamed past, a seagull flew slowly by the window, flapping its wings desperately, but something appeared slightly amiss. It took me a moment to realise that it was actually going backwards. We cast off. Even the waters in the harbour were choppy, but when we passed between the two flashing buoys that marked the harbour mouth and chugged into the Atlantic itself, the Herjulfur listed alarmingly to port. And so commenced the most hair-raising, nauseous, and undulating maritime crossing of my entire life. Nearly 3 lurching, thumping, stomach-wrenching hours later, we finally entered the calm waters of the harbour at Heimaey. the only inhabited Vestman Island, and my stomach could start the long process of forgiving me. The Vestman Islands are among the youngest land masses in the world. Situated a few miles from the southern coast of Iceland, on a clear day the mainland is highly visible, they are an archipelago with a remarkable recent history. Formed only around 5,000 years ago by underwater volcanic activity, most of the 16 islands are small, steep-sided and rockily uninhabitable. One night in January 1973, the island itself blew up. Almost without warning, a huge explosion opened a giant fissure along the eastern half, and fountains of orange lava began spraying into the night sky just a few hundred yards from Heimaey town. The next morning I set out for the volcanic eastern part of the island, keen to see the crater that produced the 1973 eruption. I strolled around the edge of the lava that provides the new shoreline. It could have been a wintry beach scene anywhere in the northern hemisphere, other than for the fact that everything was completely black. Finally, I reached the rim of the crater, where suddenly there was colour. Igneous rocks of red and yellow, and the floor of the crater was a mixture of yellow and black dust. Then I noticed that the crater was still steaming. The steady drizzle increased and more steam emerged from the ground in response because somewhere deep below, the fire mountain was still burning. In fact, you don't have to dig too deep to find temperatures in 3 figures. Islanders frequently impress visitors by coming up here and baking bread in hollowed-out recesses. I remained up there for a while, alone in the mist and rain, just me and the volcano, and scraped at the ground with my foot, sending up new clouds of steam from just below the surface. Then it struck me. I was walking on land that was younger than me. Believe me, you truly know you're getting on a bit when you're older than a flipping volcano. I rose long before dawn the next morning, the final day of my trek, in order to catch the ferry. It was very dark, and there were no lights in any of the surrounding windows. The rain-shiny streets were dark and empty. The previous night I'd seen the weather forecast on the television, read by a man with a voice so lugubrious that a couple of times I thought he'd actually dropped off. On the map right over Vestmannaeyjar was a blue circle with an arrow pointing to the northwest. In the middle of the circle was a big fat number 9. That's 9 as in severe gale 9. My last journey on the shipping forecast map would be a suitably turbulent one. The rain began to fall, picked out like fireflies in the lighthouse beam that swept overhead. The wind howled in my ears. It really was going to be another terrible crossing. Still, I hadn't eaten much, and I surely had to get my sea legs sometime. Maybe I'd be all right this time. The bright lights of the ferry shone in the distance.
Malin Hebrides, south or southeast, backing northeast 5 to 7. Showers,
Rockall,
then rain.
southwest veering west 4 or 5, increasing 6
Northwest
or 7.
Fitzroy, variable 3 or 4, mainly fair, good.
Tom Goodman-Hill was reading Attention All Shipping, A Journey Around the Shipping Forecast by Charlie Connelly. It was abridged by Beatrice Collin and the producer was Gaynor McFarlane.